Welcome back to Letting Go Like Jesus, a YouTube retreat. This is part 2 of looking at letting go as sinking into nothingness. And so we begin with a story. The story is called The Unselfconscious Saint. There was once a man who was so godly that even the angels rejoiced at his sight. But despite his great holiness, the saint didn't know he was holy. He just went about his everyday tasks, diffusing goodness the way a flower diffuses its fragrance. His great holiness lay in this: he looked beyond every person's appearance and saw to the center of their being, where they were innocent and blameless and often not aware of what they were doing. And so he loved and forgave everyone he met. So an angel one day was sent to him by God. The angel appears to him and says, "I've been sent to you by God. Ask for anything you wish, and it will be granted you. Would you like the gift of healing?" And the saint says, "No, I'd rather God did the healing." "Well," replies the angel, "would you like to bring sinners back to the path of righteousness?" "No," replied the saint, "it sounds like the work of angels." "Well, would you like to be then a paragon of virtue, so virtuous that people would want to imitate you?" And the saint replied, "No, that would make me the center of attention." "Well," said the angel, "what would you like?" "Having the grace of God, that's all I desire. So all I want is the grace of God." No, said the angel. "You must have some gift. God wants you to have some gift." "Okay," said the saint. "How about this? Let goodness be done through me, without me being aware of it." And so, it was decreed that the saint's shadow would be endowed with healing properties. So wherever his shadow fell, the sick were healed, the dead were raised, fertile lands were transformed from unfertile lands, and color returned to the faces of people weighed down by life's sorrow. Yet the saint didn't know anything about this, because everyone was so focused on his shadow. And so his wish that good be done through him, without him being aware of it, was fulfilled. That last line is key to sinking into nothingness. Goodness being done through us, without us being aware of it. And that leads us to our first formula. And it comes to us from the Gospel of Thomas, a gospel not found in the Bible, but in that gospel, there's a saying that Jesus has, a parable, that sounds to me like it came right out of his mouth. It's Logion 97. And in that Logion, Jesus says, "The Father's kingdom is like a woman who was carrying a jar full of meal. While she was walking along a distant road, the handle of the jar broke, and the meal spilled out behind her. But she didn't know it. She hadn't noticed the problem. When she reached her house, she set the jar down and discovered it was completely empty." Anything that we do to be holy, any project the ego takes on, especially when that project is the holiness project, it reinforces the ego because it's the ego doing it. It reinforces that thought of self that we were talking about in our last video. That self-reflection, that self-consciousness. It's me doing it. And so inevitably it reinforces the illusion that we're separate from God. And so what this parable is saying is holiness lies in not knowing. Just like the story we began with, holiness lies in being beyond self-awareness. Sometimes when we try too hard in prayer or try to be too virtuous, we become holier than thou. Holier than thou, excuse me. We become, as my parents like to say, holy rollers. We become people who are more interested in being perceived as holy rather than actually being holy. So in other words, holiness, the spiritual journey, religious life, all of that can become yet another hiding place for the ego. It can become yet another game of egocentricity, of pride and narcissism. So the remedy is to let go of trying to get somewhere in prayer, to let go of needing to know. As St. John of the Cross said, I was reduced to nothing and I didn't know it, just like in our parable. And so not knowing is a gift. We sink into nothingness when we're not concerned with knowing. We sink into nothingness when we forget ourselves. Because that's ultimately what we're talking about here. The saint was unself-conscious. The woman in the parable was unself-conscious. This is what sinking into nothingness means. It means being unself-conscious, not unconscious, but maybe instead going beyond self-consciousness, transcending self-consciousness, and therefore calling it unself-conscious. So it's moving beyond, not below consciousness, but beyond ego consciousness. And that we do by sinking into nothingness. And now our second formula from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. St. Paul writes very tersely, Jesus emptied himself. Jesus is an example here of letting go, in that Jesus gave his all. Sinking into nothingness means we are self-emptying. We're expending ourselves. We're spending ourselves. We're emptying ourselves. And we do that best when we're faced with situations not of our choosing. We become holy not by what we do, but by what we allow to be done to us. So this path of nothingness, letting go by sinking into nothingness, it means that we accept being nothing in failure and disappointment and suffering and trial and tragedy. It means when we're faced with those situations, we draw on God. Those situations and how we respond to them are good gauges for our depth of prayer, for our depth of reliance on God. All those situations call for us to sink into nothingness. Jesus himself is an example of this. When he was put on trial by the priest council, the Sanhedrin, and by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, he knew that death on the cross was coming, and yet he still went through with the trial. He submitted to it. He consented to God's way when it was something he he clearly didn't want to do. You remember he sweat blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. He said, if it's your will, Father, let this cup, this suffering pass from me. But not what I want, what you want. And so Jesus submits to the trial and ultimately to his own death on the cross. He sunk himself into nothingness. You see, God's transformation doesn't work on our schedules. And in fact, there's not a blessed thing we can do to make ourselves transformed. That's all God's work. God is the one who makes us holy. And so we have to let God be our holiness instead of being so focused and so rigid about our spiritual projects. All we can do when it comes to transformation is let go and consent. And that brings us to our third formula from a disciple of Meister Eckhart and another representative of 14th century German mysticism. His name is John Tauler. And he says, everything rests in this, in a bottomless sinking into the bottomless nothing. A bottomless sinking means a continuous sinking into nothingness. And we understand it like this. Every day, and really every minute of every day, we're faced with a choice. Either sink into nothingness or fight the moment, cling to the moment, react to the moment. We're faced with the choice of letting go or resisting, retaining, and reacting to whatever is happening in life. I often ask myself, well, maybe not often, but I have asked myself, at times when I feel sad, why am I unhappy? And inevitably, I come to the conclusion I'm unhappy in this moment because I'm fighting something that I don't want to happen, or because I'm trying to cling to some fleeting pleasure, or because I'm reacting to not getting my own way. That's when I'm unhappy, when I resist, when I retain, when I react. Sinking into nothingness means practicing non-resistance, non-retention, non-reaction. Because whenever we do those things, when we do resist the now, when we fight that moment, when we are clinging to something, whenever we're reacting emotionally to something, we're reinforcing the self. We're contributing to that illusion that we're separate from God. We're building up the ego. So the path of nothingness, this path of sinking out of something into nothing, this bottomless sinking into the bottomless nothing, and there John Tyler's talking about God, the bottomless nothing. That requires a continuous practice of non-resistance, non-retention, and non-reaction. Now, John Tyler also says that when we're on this journey, the spirit sinks into the divine darkness, completely into the divine darkness, into a still silence, into an inconceivable unity. John Tyler says, in this absorption, all like and unlike is lost. He says, in this abyss, the spirit loses itself and knows neither God nor itself. It knows nothing, for it's engulfed in the oneness of God and has lost all differences. When we practice this continuous letting go, this non-resistance, non-retention, this non-reaction, when we abide in a state of interior nothingness, we discover we are one with the nothing, with God. So let's go to our spiritual practice now. We can understand letting go, like we said in the last video, as sinking into nothingness. We let go by sinking into nothingness. But now we can add a little nuance to it. We let go by sinking into nothingness when we abide in a state of interior nothingness, when we're detached from our thinking. But we also sink into nothingness whenever we think of the self. We sink into nothingness whenever we get overly self-conscious. We sink into nothingness in daily life by practicing non-resistance, non-retention, non-reaction. So let go by sinking into nothingness. So let's review our formulas and our major points. First, from the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "The Father's kingdom is like a woman who was carrying a jar full of meal. While she was walking along a distant road, the handle of the jar broke, and the meal spilled out behind her along the road. She didn't know it. She hadn't noticed the problem. When she reached her house, she put the jar down and discovered it was completely empty." Number 2, Jesus emptied himself, found in Paul's letter to the Philippians. And number 3, from John Tyler, everything rests in this, a bottomless sinking into the bottomless nothing. And here are our major points. First, letting go as sinking into nothingness. It means ignoring the self, letting go of the self. It means not paying attention to ourselves. Second, to let go is to self-empty. To sink into nothingness means to not choose to do something to get holy, but rather to let things be done to you. It's not what we do, but what we allow to be done to us that makes us holy. That's walking the path of nothingness. That's what it means to sink into nothingness. And third, we sink into nothingness continuously. We sink bottomlessly into the bottomless nothing when we practice non-resistance, non-retention, and non-reaction. And finally, again, our spiritual practice, letting go means sinking into nothingness whenever we think of self, whenever we get overly self-conscious, sink into the nothingness. And sink into nothingness in daily life throughout the day by not resisting, not retaining, and not reacting. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you next time with the last round of videos for this YouTube series on letting go like Jesus. And as always, please like this video, please comment, please share with family and friends. And until next time, God bless.